Welcome back to another episode of Tonic Discussions. Today we are discussing John Carter's latest article on Postcards for Barsoom about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So a lot of people hear that and they're familiar with it. They've heard that before. They've heard, oh, you're left-handed, you must be really creative because that's associated with like the right hemisphere of your brain. And then oh, you're right-handed, oh, you're like that's normal, like very logical you know, because that's associated with the left hemisphere because you got that decussation where the neurons cross over or the axons cross over. So um, that's not that's a part of it, but what I think all of us here perhaps find most interesting about it is the work that Ian McGilchrist has done, really diving in to what these hemispheres do, their relationship, and also how the left hemisphere is supposed to be subordinate to the right hemisphere and the master and his emissary, where that holistic thinking of the right hemisphere is supposed to kind of see the big picture, and then the left hemisphere can generate models so that you can actually interact with reality in a meaningful way and then go kind of back and forth and always have that right hemisphere predominant so that you don't end up going too far down the path of a bad model. You'll get snapped out of it because that right hemisphere can kind of see it. But we're going to go into the weeds on this and then also how it relates to political differences between typical right and left stuff, like how's that defined and how does it relate, because John's article has some good visuals to it as well that I think make a very strong case that that is a good way to chop it up. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to John to kind of give us a background of his thinking on this article, and then we'll just continue the discussion.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Grant. That was an excellent summary of the sort of the actual core difference according to the McGill-Christian or McGill-Christian, I don't know, the hemispheric hypothesis. Um, so yeah, I mean, basically, your right brain is for experiencing and understanding reality, and then your left hemisphere is much more specialized towards instrumentalizing that and manipulating reality. Um, and there's like a lot that could be said on that subject. I mean, Bill Gilchrist himself has written, two books, one of which is a two-volume, 1,600-page, tome, uh, kind of unpacking all of uh, the implications of that and looking at it from all the different facets and stuff. It's really a quite remarkable in its explanatory power of how human cognition works. Um, so like, I mean, the article itself was more sort of like taking that as like something of an extended metaphor, but maybe a little bit more than a metaphor. I don't know for for the political divide, because like when you look at network graphs of the internet, where you divide things into conservative and liberal, left versus right, what have you, and you look at the communities that kind of organically form, whether in the blogosphere or on Twitter or on Facebook, any platform, whether you're talking about the United States or Brazil or Argentina, any country that you look at, you see these kind of two broad communities emerge that are really densely connected internally to each other, and then only kind of loosely coupled between each other, which is pretty similar to the network architecture of the human brain. Both of the hemispheres are tight are strongly connected to themselves, and you just have this like sort of like little corpus callosum between them, shuttling the most important information back and forth. Uh, and that kind of got me thinking, like, well, is this political divide really just a kind of emanation of that sort of bilateral cognitive architecture that humans and every other animal species has in its central nervous system? And it would kind of make sense actually, because some people have a tendency to be a little bit more left brain in their orientation, and others tend to be a little bit more balanced, meaning in practice the right hemisphere is more in charge, which is kind of the optimal state to be in. So you would kind of expect that they would separate into those different communities. So then the question is like, okay, um, what are the actual sort of broad psychological traits characterizing those two communities? Like if you look at their discourse, their behavior, like what are they like? Well, on the left hand, on the political left, you tend to find a lot of fascination with these intricate, abstract models of society. Um, everything from Marxism to critical theory to as we were talking about before we started recording, climate change. Uh, they always have these kinds of utopian visions of like, here's how the world should work, right? And the discourse tends to be sort of around elaborating those models and also driving towards, how can we use these models to improve the world, which always means making the world more like our models. Um, so it's really a discourse which ultimately, when you boil it down to it, is sort of focused around acquiring and using power in order to alter things in the world. Um, and I don't think that's like necessarily a bad thing, right? Like in and of itself, it's like this actually, it's part of life to change things in the world. But then you look at the political right, and its discourse, at least for the last 10 years, has been much more around like, what is the nature of reality? What is true about reality? How do things actually work in the world? Like, forget about your fancy models. Like, what's human nature really like? And this has always been kind of a core aspect of conservatism. Um, you look at the relationship of the two sides to time. Uh, on the right, you tend to have this sort of more traditionalist outlook where like history is seen as this kind of flow, this kind of organic unfolding. Um, and the political left tends to see it as more like a very sort of like progressive arc of history that bends in a certain direction. And, each moment in time is also somewhat isolated from the ones that came before it. Like it doesn't matter what the history was. We're just going to do what we're going to do now because that's, it's the current year and that's how we do things now. It's like it's much more separated, sliced up way of looking at time. Uh, which again actually turns out to be very similar to how the left and the right hemispheres respectively actually do experience time. Um, so you look at a few different aspects of this, which I did in the article, and it sort of does look broadly like, at least, maybe accidentally, but the political left and the political right actually do seem to somewhat correspond to the traits that you would expect from left hemisphere dominance versus right left hemisphere balance. Um, Actually, even another thing is like the how the left tends to be very manic in its approach to things. Like, um, you know, we can do this, and we're going to change the world, and who cares about um, the facts, essentially. Which is the left hemisphere does tend to be very unreasonably optimistic about things and to sort of ignore obvious obstacles, whereas the right hemisphere tends to, like it's characteristic mental illness is actually depression because it looks at like all of the aspects of reality, many of which aren't necessarily very nice or reassuring, and it will sometimes kind of sink into despondency like, oh, we're screwed, there's nothing we can do, right? And that actually, if you look at like the characteristic mood on the political right, not just now but like almost any time through history. Like look at Oswald Spengler, for example. It's this kind of like resigned, depressive pessimism. Like there's nothing we can do to improve the world. Everything is doomed. Uh,
So
so
since this is so broad, I want to kind of zoom in on that because otherwise we might have a hard time of picking something to focus in on because there's
sure.
just so many different places that we can go. The idea of right hemisphere dominance and depression. because that's something that really stuck out to me in the article because I wasn't aware of that before. And it just resonates so strongly, but also it kind of makes me think how critical it is to have the right balance. So it's like you want the right hemisphere dominance because that's kind of what it's, our brains are designed to be most efficient as, but you need that left hemisphere to actually interact with the world. The right hemisphere is critical to see it, but to actually interact in a meaningful way, you can't interact with the world as it is cognitively. You have to build a model to make sense of it, to translate the world into meaningful information. Just like
And
light.
not just that, but like, I mean, you need to use your hands to actually do things in the world. Like having agency isn't just sitting there watching it and experiencing, it's also operating on it, which necessarily involves reducing, like sort of blocking out of your mind all the sort of like, wonderful, like, wow, isn't everything amazing? And sort of focusing on something and just turning it into a tool, right? Like removing its own agency and just operating on that thing as a thing. Like, even if that thingness is not actually in the end the truth of what you of the object or the process that you're operating on, um, it is a necessary illusion in order to be able to operate upon it. And if you don't do that, you lose agency, and then you're just passive and you sink into depression, basically.
And you have with a model, I mean, you have to have a model to interact with the world, like Grant said, but your model has to be useful because that can also lead to depression if you, cycle through a series of models to try to interact with the world and your models are inaccurate or obsolete or whatever. And, you know,
And
your
then also,
interactions with the world backfire or don't go the way you thought. Anyway.
yeah, then I also think sometimes like just getting the big picture, like, or even like the truth, can be like pretty depressing. So just to give you an example, maybe that you can relate to, and some of the listeners who are also writers, sometimes when I write stuff, I get really pumped up, like I have an idea and I really want to like do this, and it's a great feeling, right? It's something against depression, basically, when you feel like that. And it's also kind of instrumental, right? So you're doing something, you're interacting with the world, you're manipulating the world in a sense, right? And you're also very specific, and you feel good about it. But when the right brain hemisphere kicks in, and I think I wrote about that even at some point. It's like almost you realize you can't write anything that isn't wrong. It's just it can be done, because in a sense there's always like more to add, like other aspects that are important, like caveats, like
Yes,
an
but
infinite amount of caveats. So, and I have that sometimes literally, that I think I can't do anything because it's all wrong, and it's all bad, even like with interacting with reality, can realize it's basically you can only screw up, and it's that sort of thing, I guess, that is also part of the depressive state, right? That realization that that's basically pointless. You have no power, it's just too complex, and that it's kind of like this nihilism that creeps in. And I think that it's actually true in a sense, right? So that's pretty depressing, but you kind of need that balance, because to interact at all, in a sense, you have to step back from that and just go for stuff, and I guess also that's might be one of the reasons why like doing practical stuff can be so therapeutic, right? Because when you like do something really practical, there's just much less of a question, it's kind of like useful, and you do it, and that's it, you feel good about it, and that's kind of therapeutic and helps against depression, so yeah. But I was just gonna say that I can see that sort of depressive state of the right hemisphere. I think I can see that in myself as well, in my experience.
Something that, to address what Daniel said about, maybe the left hemisphere causing some depression too when your models don't work. I know, I think we can still use the same framework, because how are you going to know that your model doesn't work? You know, that right hemisphere has got to be active to be able to kick in and see that, kind of just like what Luke was saying. I think that people that are stuck left hemisphere hard, they're like, no, my model's right. And the world is like all the information that's coming in, I'm not seeing any of that information that's proving my model to be ridiculous. And they just go hard all the way in. And
Yeah,
then,
it
you
can
know,
give you
they'll kill
power.
people that,
Yeah,
you know, get in the way of,
exactly. It can make you powerful, you know. If you're like a really fanatic with a certain idea, these are like some of the like most powerful people that like just go at it, you know, like for decades, you know, because they have their model, they fully believe in it, you know, and no right hemisphere is getting in the way, and boom, you know.
I guess it's like a question of incentives and costs. Because, you know, if you're, you know, on this ship like the Titanic, and I don't know, you have this opportunity to usurp the captain's seat and take over, and that increases your prestige or your pay or whatever. So that's all you're focused about. But of course, you're not competent to run the ship, and you crash it into an iceberg. You know, it's like the bigger picture. It's obviously a bad thing, but you're so focused on your short term. Like, this benefits me personally, even if it harms the whole, and even if in the long run it winds up harming me because it sinks the ship that I'm on. But it's like people trapped in that left hemisphere way of thinking. I mean, you can think about a lot of examples of that recently, you know, in our own culture, like just burning through the seed corn, you know, of our civilization, these inherited or accumulated riches. It, just for like a short term, like, let me get my next bonus check or exceed next quarterly earnings or what, even if it bankrupts the company, or, you know what I mean? Like, that's where you really
So
see
like
it.
I was just reading over the last week or so. I'm getting really into Bernard Cornwell, and I just read his Arthurian cycle. Um, and because I'm also, you know, reading and thinking about the hemispheres, just like watching how King Arthur is depicted in that trilogy really kind of made me think about this, because um basically Arthur, of course, Arthur, you know, he's brave and he's wise, and he's very practical. There's a sort of one of the background things in the series is this religious ferment between the rising religion of Christianity in Wales and the old like pagan druidic faith, which is kind of dying away. And you know, Arthur kind of doesn't take a strong position on either one of those. He's just kind of like, you know, like as long as the general peace is maintained. Um, and he's also not a king in that series, which is kind of important here. Because like, you know, he's like the bastard son of Uther, so as far as he's concerned, like he doesn't have a claim to the throne. He doesn't want to be the king. He doesn't want the responsibility that comes with it. And he also took an oath to uh to make sure that Mordred would take the throne, because Mordred is the actual sort of like legal descendant of Uther. Um, Even though it turns out, of course, that Mordred is just this beast of a creature who is just like, you know, just ugly on the inside and out, just absolutely brutal, like selfish, venal, like just cruel, just an awful, awful human being. But the oath takes precedence. And, you know, everyone kind of wants Arthur to be king, but Arthur himself has no interest in being king, even though he is ideally suited to be king, because he's able to see sort of like, you know, all sides of any dispute, and he's able to, you know, and he justice is very important to him. Um, Maintaining the kind of harmony of the kingdom is kind of, you know, his what he wants more than anything else. And this is sort of similar it's almost like a metaphor for like that interhemispheric struggle, where um you know, the left hemisphere just is focused on power, just pretty much for its own sake, and thinks it should be in charge, because its whole purpose is power. It's power over reality, right? um and the right hemisphere has no particular interest in being in power, which makes it ideally suited to be in power, because its main focus is actually the truth. And then, of course, you see this in politics as well. I mean, that whole thing, that whole digression on Arthur, I mean, this is like sort of archetypal um, of human politics, where it's like a truism that, like, you know, the person who doesn't want power is the person you want in power, and the person who wants power should be kept as far away from it as humanly possible. And it does also, I think, get to the political dilemma that we're experiencing now, where you know, it's, to me, I think, pretty obvious that we'd be a lot better off if, you know, our current elite were sort of cleaned out and replaced with people with a more broadly sort of, like, you know, right wing perspective in the modern sense of that. But as much as there's all this discourse about the nature of power on the right, it tends to be much more sort of like what is true about how power works, kind of thing, and very little in terms of, like, you know, practical steps towards taking power. Whereas, like, the left is just like laser focused on keeping and maintaining power to the exclusion of all else.
Hey,
With the
John,
result of,
what do you think would be, you know, you're describing like the right hemisphere being the one that should be in power because they're not seeking it. What would be like a good background to look for in somebody who you would say this would be like a good training for a leader, like a Socratic philosopher king or whatever?
man, that's a hard question.
I'd heard one. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, the people that you is Harrison in the chat?
I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like this gets into logocracy.
Yeah. I guess it would. That would be like, well, Lobachevsky would probably say, for like, it depends on the position, right? Because he distinguishes between like the personality type of like a head of state versus a head of government, and then kind of different qualifications for what, you know, what in the States would be considered a congressman
So to be
versus a
clear for the
senator.
listeners, so head of state would be like a president or a king, and the head of government would be like a prime minister.
Right. And in like the United States, it's kind of like the president is kind of takes on both those roles. But the Lobachevsky thought the head of state should be kind of like older, wiser, more measured, and the head of government should be like younger, more energetic, more like you know, a a doer, right? You know, so probably more energetic and left-brained in the sense of going out and getting things done, and then the head of state watching over all of it is more like taking it all in, and then what would the word be? Kind of well, balancing and moderating and saying, okay,
Yeah,
well,
like a
no,
moderating, governing impulse to sort of like, well, maybe don't do that thing that you think is a good idea because actually
yeah,
it's a bad idea. Yeah, right.
yeah,
But like
and then for like a
not serving
background,
it, not serving as like a source of um a source of action, but an inhibition to action, essentially, which
yeah,
is
well,
actually
a little bit of
kind
both.
of that's kind of actually how the British constitutional monarchy is intended to work, where the monarch is
Hmm.
that the crown does not originate legislation but has veto power over legislation.
Hmm. Well, and so Lobachevsky wasn't totally black and white about it. Like, he did think that the head of state should have some initiative in you know, proposing certain legislation or making certain decisions related to like education and education and science and and what else? Well, a couple other things. But like for a background, if you have that personality type that's like you know, well, if you have that personality type and a person with that experience, like in our world, chances are it's going to be some kind of professional, right? Um, like you're probably not going to get you're not going to cull that person from the ranks of like you know, people working most kind of like you know, small jobs or whatever. But so when it comes to background, there's probably some backgrounds that are better than others, but uh I don't know if there would be like a, you know, an ideal background. You know, what do you guys think? Should we go for non-professionals for head of state?
No, one thing that was interesting, the pattern that you mentioned, I was kind of reminded, I mean, it didn't exactly map onto this, but similar in a way. And it's Trump and sorry, Sorry, my cat's kind of giving me trouble here.
Sorry.
Trump and Steve Bannon, in terms of the way they work together, where it's like Trump, maybe he was like, I don't know. Bannon seemed to kind of provide like a bigger picture strategy, whereas Trump would kind of get an idea in his head and just, fire at the hip and just kind of say or do things that maybe weren't so coherent in a big picture way. Whereas Steve Bannon, at least when they were working together before, Jared Kushner kind of, maneuvered him out, was able to kind of like give him, I don't know, keep him kind of on point in terms of whatever his strategy was, it was this kind of an interesting dynamic the two of them had.
And yeah, I just want to say about, because your question was like, how do we get like the Socratic philosopher king or whatever? And I think what you can see in history, and it totally makes sense also in light of the left and right brain hemisphere thing, is that leaders are often like they rise against their own will, basically, right? So they're basically forged by circumstances. Even Trump, you go back like to all his interviews, like he's kind of musing about politics all the time, like for decades, but he's like, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, but yeah, maybe, I should, but I don't want to, and then at some point he just didn't see any chance, right? And just
I've heard Cliff High, who, obviously everything Cliff High says take with a lot of salt, but like I've heard him say several times that he thinks Trump was approached by elements within the American security state that are opposed to the bulk of the state in order to run, like that. Basically he wasn't like seeking power, like it was like he was approached by people who were like, no, we need you specifically to do this because you're actually the perfect person to do it.
And people who do seek power, they cannot wrap their heads around that concept, right? They project their own like power hunger like onto everybody. But when you look at it, it's like actually not the case. The best people, they don't want to do that. And you can see that like with Caesar, he didn't like plot crossing the Rubicon for his entire life. It's just he was forced to do that, and you can see that again and again, and that's kind of like
and repeatedly in that, like from the Rubicon crossing on, he was constantly trying to like find accommodations with the Senate and make peace with the minimum amount of death and suffering. Like, yeah, no, totally.
Yeah, or Putin, he like didn't plot world domination like from a young age. He just was basically like a strange coincidence that he even ended up in power, right? And this is just like repeatedly you can see that, and that's kind of like the paradox, because when we talk about what kind of leaders do we want and how do we get them, we can't just build a school and teach leaders. I mean, a leader would like, I don't know, emerge and then found his school or whatever, or be his own school, or just by circumstance, or totally come from a totally unexpected corner. Right? So I think that's kind of like the paradox when we think about these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the intrinsic problems is the moment you have some kind of system, some kind of formalized system for selecting leaders, which you almost have to have, but then the power hungry will start finding ways to game that system in order to climb that ladder. So, you can start with a system which is specifically designed to prevent those kinds of people from getting into power, and come back a few generations later, and lo and behold, that's exactly the kind of person you have in power now, because they figured out how to game that system. And then you need a new system, and it just kind of repeats. So it's almost like the only way to not have that happen is to have no system, but I don't know how that would work.
Or have sunset laws kind of in place with the system where every so often it has to be completely redone. Of course, then that system itself would get co-opted by the bad actors,
That's the right hemisphere right there. Like, it's just totally depressing, and there is no solution. That's just
there is no solution. Exactly. There's it's not a problem to be solved. It's just a predicament that humanity has to live with, essentially.
So just to interject very quickly about this concept of leaders and where they come from and how they rise. and particularly the idea that there must be some sort of system in place for that to happen. I think about some of the most successful, and I'll put that around 16 quotation marks around successful, but like someone like Genghis Khan, for example, who was abandoned by his tribe in his youth, who was essentially an outsider, an outcast. And that is another type of leader that can rise up. Someone who sees the external facets from a distance, all of the dynamics in play from some sort of whether the distance is self-imposed or some kind of an exile. This also seems to generate, in many cases, the most successful kind of leaders. And that's the one who takes advantage of a sort of longer view of the entire dynamics of a region or a culture, and then just kind of parachutes into the situation. Takes it, because of that distance, they're able to take advantage and exploit weaknesses and build alliances that that other people within the system that are sort of trapped, you could say, within the system couldn't imagine themselves. So I think to some degree, we're talking about a leader, a true leader, I think arises more from imagination than any other quality. And part of that imagination is the careful observation of reality. And again, I think from a remove, it works better. You could talk about Moses in the same light, for example. From a remove, I think that you get the kind of leader who can imagine all kinds of potential futures, and therefore has a little bit more flexibility in terms of like what they're able to do. If we were to believe, I don't know if it's apocryphal that Genghis Khan himself kind of changed the composition of the army, but whoever did that, whoever had the imagination, the military imagination, to say, no, we will fight from horseback with arrows or with ranged weaponry, that served to conquer, almost the entire world from a certain point of view. At a time when regional dominance was about the best you could hope for. So if we're talking about specifically domination, we could say like, well, what did Genghis Khan want? I think that one danger, I think, when we're talking about the hemispheres of the brain is like, and I've heard people kind of say this in this discussion a couple of times, and I know it's probably colloquial or semantic, but they would say something along the lines of, well, the left hemisphere wants this and the right hemisphere wants that. And that's a very dangerous linguistic territory to get into, because the brain does not want anything, either in part or in whole, any more than a muscle does. Gets to the heart of John's article in a sense, where it's sort of like
it's just a function. It's just a function. Like that part of the body has a function, and it just does that. It's not like
it's a tool. It's a tool, but like
there's no moral like sort of understanding that can be applied there. It's just a thing that it does, right?
Or a desire of any kind, I would argue. And so like that's the thing. There are no desires. There are tools, and there are will. There are wills to accomplish things with the tools that we have. And so, it's like the metaphor my wife gave me one time of like a skateboarder, one big leg. And so if your goal is to become a very good skateboarder, you're essentially going to interrupt the symmetry of your being to some degree. So it's like when we're looking at a state of being, we're looking at symmetry or harmony or conflict, or what you could call antithetical opposition, right? Those are the three possible states. If we're looking at a being as something that's separate, at least, or in some way that is, there was this dual state of being, this idea of a dual consciousness that wants separate things. I don't see it that way. But certainly the tools, the more, it's kind of like if all you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if one hemisphere of your brain is far more developed than the other one, chances are something like that logic is going to kick in. It won't cause you to desire new things, but it might limit your perception about how to obtain certain results from reality, how to interact with it best. When we look at something like this, the central panel of the Sistine Chapel, for example, We have on, this is just goes to John's point about how this precedes anything having to do with neurobiology or biology in general. What we see is on the left side of that panel, we see Adam, the man who is grounded, who is situated on a hillside. And he's looking up to the right where God is. And God is reaching through the veil. In this case, it's a cloak shaped like the human brain. I don't know if that's pretty common knowledge that like
Miguel
so
Christ
God
actually talks about this somewhere
is,
somewhere in the matter of things. Yeah.
right, and you can actually expand that if you look at the above and the panels above and below. It expands that story somewhat. But like the central idea too is that I think is reified by that in the sense that yes, obviously when we're talking about what the use of the right hemisphere appears to be more about the whole of reality and about its hierarchy. So like the idea that God is situated above, flying in this brain shape, which again, literally the right hemisphere we're looking at. So it's in this sense sort of like, okay, so that's the tool that you use to access the divine to some degree, which is hierarchical by nature, which means that it places things in the order of, in the metaphysical order that they belong in, let's say. And then you look at the other side of it and you see the grounded Adam, who is, I guess, representative of that left hemisphere, which is like engaging in regular action with reality, with the material of reality. And so, I think that can be, those states could be in harmony with each other and should be in harmony with each other. I don't think it's so much about the right brain is in power or in control. I think what it means is something along the lines of they're in their proper order of function.
And this is
you apprehend reality with the right. Yeah.
This is why I always try to frame it in terms of like, you have left hemisphere dominance for like, in that case, like it's sort of usurped its proper role, right? It's put itself in the place of God. But the alternative to that is not actually right hemisphere dominance per se. It's actually more balance between the two.
Right.
Go on.
Right. The harmony, not symmetry, because symmetry would be a copy. What we're looking at is something that's acting in concert, parts that are acting in concert with each other. Like we do look for beauty. We do find beauty and symmetry in certain other elements of our physical material, like a diver, for instance. Like when you're ranking the quality of their dive, you're looking for perfect symmetry for one side matching the other. But we're looking, interestingly enough, at the arts, we are looking for harmony, whether it's in music, whether it's in painting, in dance. That's typically like the way that all of these parts work. Yeah, there we go. And as you see the arm down in the lower left corner, that's actually Eve's arm. And you'll see the again, what could be called the opposite, the confluence or the contradiction of this scenario, where you have Eve on the left and then you have the devil on the right. But again, it's like I think that point of connection, that's what we're looking for. Like in other words, that's where the artist wants us to look. That is the most important part of this entire picture. It is not God or Adam, but that point of connection between the two, which is this, again, which would be using the body, including the brain, for its whole purpose, which would be, of course, to service the good and to expand life and intelligence and order throughout the universe. And I think that,
just looking at this image, what I find kind of interesting about it is, so, Adam's on the left hemisphere, God's on the right hemisphere. But due to like visual cross-linking, the right field of view actually goes to the left hemisphere and vice versa. So it's almost like this kind of intuitive, like I don't know, I very strongly doubt like Michelangelo sort of like understood that at some kind of like neurobiological level, right? Like this was.
Well, he did understand it. He didn't understand it. He had different language for it. He absolutely understood it because he was apprehending reality directly from the right hemisphere, using the right hemisphere to apprehend objective reality directly. He didn't need to know anything about biology. He didn't need to look at a cadaver.
Right. But
He
that's sort
understands
of,
it.
yeah. So when I
Yeah.
say like he didn't understand, I should have been more precise. Like he wouldn't have had like the modern contemporary knowledge of the hemispheric cognitive differences, right? I mean, he was obviously thinking something to do with the brain. I mean, I don't think it's at all accidental that God's sort of cloud or whatever that is, clamshell or
That's
whatever
a
it is.
cloak, I think, and that is the
Yeah, it's a
veil. That is
cloak,
the
but it's
veil, essentially.
right. But it's very brain looking, and that's probably not accidental. I mean, you know, he had a background in anatomy, right? Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
But
So like,
again, like with the knowledge
but
of
you've
like
got
how that all corresponded, you know, we've long thought of the brain as the seat of consciousness, like long before we had sort of
yeah.
exhaustive electronic mappings of it.
You know, people have
Uh,
understood for a long time they get knocked on the head and you lose consciousness, and
you get all
sometimes
funny.
you get all funny and you never really come back from that, and that's been known for ages.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's fairly obvious when you think about it. I mean, it's sort of like all of the most important transactional gear is concentrated in very small space, not just in mankind, but in most animals. At least anything that's got a body plan even remotely similar is going to concentrate all of its transactional gear, like its observational apparatus, is all going to be contained in a very small area. And yeah, of course, we know it. We know you cover an eye and you can't see out of that eye. You lose the eye, you can never see out of it. A lot of that is very, it's sort of like everything that's transpired since then. And I'm saying maybe across the last 300 to 400 years, in terms of the language development of explaining the mechanisms in reducible detail, I think has actually led us off the beaten path, off track somewhat in terms of understanding, how biology interacts with reality.
Well, we got
That'd be the
so
nature of that'd be the nature of those models, So it's like everything that we're trying to do in science is trying to model it. So to an extent, the more fidelity and granularity you try and get, just like Luke was saying at the beginning, the more nuance you're missing, that the deeper that you want to drill down. I wanted to comment on the leadership thing based on what Mark was saying. And I think it's obvious that what you want in a leader is balance. We want that optimal balance, that optimal hierarchy, whatever that is. And I would say, where do they come from? I what better person to pick than somebody that, because of that balance, they've been able to be successful. They've had that right hemisphere dominance, but they've been able to maintain that internal locus of control that's enabled them to have agency and be very, very successful without gaming the system. Ideally in a society where you can still do that without being somewhat of a piece of shit would be optimal. And then with that wealth and prosperity, they're driven by noblesse oblige to lead. I think that's kind of what everybody wants in a leader.
A good example might be Napoleon, actually, because everybody's kind of like now reading up on him because the movie is coming out, and it turns out that he's like one of the most remarkable guys like ever. I mean, this is just crazy when you read his story. And what Mark was saying, about like being an kind of an outsider can sometimes help, and that was definitely the case for him. And like he was like this total military genius, but he also wrote romance novels. I mean, talk about a guy who was like balanced. I mean, it's crazy, like total intellectual. He could recite Goethe, by heart, and like it's just totally incredible when you look at it. And I think that's kind of like what you want in a leader, as you said, Grant, that kind of balance where you can be like a romantic, write romance novels kind of thing, and also be like a military hero. I mean, and be
And
like
just
a
to
math genius, like that Napoleon also was. He could calculate
uh-huh.
trajectories, for cannons in his head and stuff, and then go to some blacksmith and the next day and give him instructions like from memory, because he saw a certain hill. He knew exactly what kind of cannon he should forge, based on his calculations in his head. I mean, it's like, if you have that kind of balance, then like at least you're like a great man. I mean, whether the what you use it for then is maybe not a different question, but yeah. So I
I feel
think
like
that's
his initial rise to power too, like it wasn't, I don't know Napoleon's biography terribly well. And like obviously, he made himself emperor, so there is some degree of ambition there, but it seems to have started with him sort of like looking around at post-revolutionary France and just like the horrible things that were going on and saying, you know what? No, I can't allow Robespierre and these monsters to continue doing this stuff. Hence
If
turning to
history
Canada.
rhymes, it's probably something that may happen in the
Yeah,
U.S. of
well, that's
A
yeah.
too.
Charles Haywood had a whole long essay a while back, asking about the red Caesar versus blue Caesar question,
Yeah.
because there's this ongoing, it's like, okay, if we're gonna have Caesarism, like is the Caesar gonna come from the left or from the right? Because like Napoleon would be obviously an example of left Caesar, in the sense that like he preserved much of what the revolution had done, um, maybe just to keep the peace or what have you. Rolled some of it back, uh, but
I mean, he
um,
was a populist, right? I mean, and he
yeah,
definitely
yeah.
made the situation better for the people, and that's always the test, like whether you think of leaders like in whether they're left or right or whatever, if they're like actually making a difference for the people, that's kind of like the yardstick, I think, and that he definitely did. I mean, this was like a
Mm.
total crazy, like this was Russia 1990s, maybe even worse kind of stuff, when
Well, I
he
would
took
say
power.
I would say more like Russia in 1919.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, right. And he, if you read his letters, I read a bunch of his original works, and he was also like not against religion at all. He protected the religion from like all those revolutionary crazies, and
yeah, like he like because like they initially were like trying to turn all the churches into like temples of reason and have metric time and all of this like ridiculous shit. And like Napoleon kind of got rid of all that. He's like, okay, the priests can come back. Like the Catholic Church is fine. Like we're not going to interfere. Um,
I think if you have that balance, that is inevitable because you're going to hold yourself accountable for outcomes. So really, I think leaders at that scale, they're all going to have some form of grandiose narcissism to even think that they're worthy of being in that role. And, in the case of Napoleon, it sounds like wasn't narcissistic personality disorder because he had the goods to back it up. And that's what makes it pathological, is when it's not aligned with the evidence. But if he really was, the shit, it's not
Well,
it's not a
it's also worth
personality
noting that
disorder.
like at least early on, Napoleon was not given to he was given to expeditions, but not to military adventures, or certainly not to aggression. I mean, it was essentially the alliance between Great Britain and Russia that kind of forced, and the Third Coalition that kind of forced his hand, so to speak, in becoming a military empire. Um, so it's like I think that ambition, yeah, certainly, that's part of it. But what is it, the ambition to do what exactly? You know what I mean? Like when we think about Donald Trump has just spent the rest of his days in Mar-a-Lago, just sort of golfing and having a good time. And Luke had mentioned or maybe it was Grant that mentioned the noblesse oblige, the idea that like, well, I need to give back. And then you add to that also the outsider syndrome, because even though Donald Trump was raised by a wealthy real estate developer, certainly if you look at his upbringing, it was kind of it was almost a Graduate type situation where, like, again, like he's the crass outsider. He's the guy in what you call it. What was the name of Rodney Dangerfield's character in the golfing movie? I'm sorry.
Caddyshack. Yeah, I don't know his name.
Caddyshack.
Just
Oh
Caddyshack.
God.
But
Wow.
yeah, everybody knows that
Yeah.
character.
Oh God. Yeah.
Something
It's
with
sort
Back
of
to
like he's that
School.
guy. Yeah, or Back to School, right? He's the guy who kind of like the brusque New Yorker who deals with mobsters in Atlantic City, and he's garish and he's gaudy, and everybody thinks his taste stinks, and and like it's sort of like he's sort of the outsider amongst that group, let's say,
He's
of the sort of the
Ho-
wealthy
Homer.
titans of
He's Homer
industry.
Simpson's idea of what a rich person does, right? Like,
Right, right, right,
I will
right,
build
right.
myself a 10-story golden body. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so it's sort of like so you have like those qualities. And again, it's sort of like so he didn't have to take this step. I think it's interesting, this theory that somehow he was corralled or in some way uh promoted into this position or convinced by other people like to do it. It doesn't really sound like him, but I think it's very possible that he, having seen interviews that he did even in the '90s, late '90s, where he was talking about the sort of the transition into a bipolar, Sino-American world, and the idea of the trade deficits that were developing between, particularly specifically China and the United States, and the problems inherent in NAFTA. He's been talking about that stuff for a very long time, and so maybe not so much ambition, and maybe a bit of hubris is what we're talking about. The idea of, I can fix this. I know that if I was in that seat, I could turn this car around, or at least steer it away from the cliff.
Well, I
And
think
so
I I think there's
and that may be left
I think
brain, left
it's
hemisphere
really
for all I know.
well, I mean, like, it's, I think, obviously every human being has both left and right hemisphere, right? And I think it's almost never the case that even any given individual human is sort of like purely in one or the other mode throughout the course of their life. Um, and if you look at leaders like Napoleon or Julius Caesar, and who knows, maybe Trump will ultimately be looked on as one. I don't think he will, but like, certainly a great man in American history already. But there does seem to be this kind of like initial, like, just comparing Caesar and Napoleon, right? There's like this sort of like initial reluctance to take power, uh, and then this kind of like sort of almost like resigned sense of like, well, if no one else is going to do it, like, I guess I'll be the one. And but then as things go on, because they end up being quite successful, uh, they pass a moment of hubris. Like, they get to a certain point where maybe they do push a little bit too far, which you could sort of see as maybe like they tip a little bit too far into like the left hemisphere sort of power seeking mode, right? Like, and that ends up being their downfall. Like, if Napoleon had not tried to declare war on the entirety of Europe and become the emperor of the entire continent, if he hadn't tried to invade Moscow and all these kinds of things, he probably would have reigned quite a bit longer, and that imperial system would have lasted longer. Similarly, like Julius Caesar, like, if he'd, well, I mean, his downfall was being a bit too trusting, I suppose. But even that is a kind of hubris. Like, I have set such a great example, and I am so beloved that surely my enemies finally will see the light, nor would they dare move against me, because I am now worshipped as a god. And it turns out, actually, no, they will move against you, and that'll be the end of you. So
So maybe it's just that they get out of balance. But I mean, I think that's key. Like, having that balance, that's what you want. I mean, that's what you want for everybody, right? Everybody wants to be optimal, right? Like, the optimal balance for doing, like, interacting with reality in a meaningful, positive way, assuming you got kind of normal morals and you're, neurotypical in terms of like levels of empathy and stuff like that. If you want to be able to leave the world a better place than when you got here, like you want to have that balance or you're not going to be able to be effective. If you're out of balance, all the efforts that you engage in to maximize power are ultimately going to be counterproductive because they're not aligned with reality.
But
And
to
if
confuse
you,
things a little bit more, there's different kinds of balance, right? So you got like static balance, like for instance, when you're like standing on like one foot and you're not moving in like a yoga pose or something like that, right? And you could maybe analogize that to like both hemispheres being in balance at the same time. And then you've got like dynamic balance where you're constantly shifting your position, but you remain sort of stable throughout, right? Like for instance, when you're walking, you're dynamically balanced. Like at any given point in the movement, like you could topple over because you're completely unbalanced, but like uh the movement itself is balanced so you don't fall. And that would be sort of a little bit more like shifting from like a very much left brain only way of interacting with the world to a right brain only way of interacting with the world and sort of or observing the world, I suppose, and kind of like going back and forth between those two.
well,
So it's
since the world is dynamic, you want the dynamic balance. I would stipulate that dynamic balance is what you want. And really, even from a physiological perspective, in that metaphor, I think it perhaps is the same. If you have excellent dynamic balance, like I can't think of a neurological condition that you would not have good static balance if you have good dynamic balance. Although I mean, there's maybe some. I won't get into that. That's getting too far into the weeds. But
Yeah, but
what I
maybe
wanted
It's
to
interesting with like, I mean, some of the things like you have great generals who are not successful in peacetime. They just get into trouble. They just kind of fizzle out, and then they go in the civilian world. Like, I mean, thinking about some of the generals who were successful during the Civil War on both sides.
yeah,
Wasn't the people who were
Sherman,
like the good career
yeah,
officers, during peacetime? It
Sherman
was
was a great general, but he was a terrible president, for example.
Well, I want to come back to that distinction between the head of state and head of government. Add a couple things and then ask a question. So one of the other things that Lobachevsky says in Logocracy, he talks about two types of genius, and he says there's the type of genius that is that kind of like has a almost like a spoiled or like mollycoddled upbringing, or just a comfortable upbringing, and so hasn't really encountered any hardship to kind of forge a certain type of personality. He says there's a second type of genius, which is the one that has struggles from an early age and has to put all of his talents, all of his genius, all of his energy into applying all of his capacity, all of his ability into like overcoming certain hardships and learning certain hard lessons. And that I can't remember if he says that's the kind of genius that should be a head of state or not, but he says that's the kind of leadership, or that's the kind of genius that's kind of both are necessary, but that's the one that is kind of required for a certain type of leadership position.
The first
and
is the
so-
one that you want writing poetry and
right, or
doing
or
the
just
sciences and yeah.
yeah.
Well,
And,
I
but
think
you want
even
someone
more
with life
important.
experience.
Yeah. I was thinking like if you could sum it up though, if you could say like, okay, like there some genius could come from both categories or something in between. I think maybe the factor that matters the most of all is did you have skin in the game at any point? So I think that's why so many leaders hail from a sort of a military background to some degree. If you look at the whole entire landscape of human history, you're going to be looking at most, I'd say probably the vast majority of leaders, or at least somewhat have a military background.
So
And
you
I think
think
that's
that's
because,
changed a lot since like World War I? I mean, at some point, generals and
yeah,
or officers used to lead from the front, and now they
I
lead from the
actually
rear, as in
I
many
actually looked in
yeah, it's
hundreds of
changed in a lot of
miles to
ways.
the rear.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
I looked into
Well,
this from the question of the European or the British monarchy not too long ago, and it turns out the last king to lead from the front was like in the mid 18th century or something like that. So yeah, it's been some time since our leaders have exposed themselves to direct physical danger.
Yeah, and I think that that's key, and that you're seeing. I think you can almost say that at least some of the failures of leadership are born from that. And I'm not going to say all of them, but like you have to think that to some degree, when everything is an abstraction, including life and death and military adventures, and just sort of like when you think about the meat grinder that that is the Ukrainian Russo war. It's sort of like the idea that you would be so distant from it, and that you would be sending these mass shipments of cash and arms to something that's essentially no more real to you than a computer simulation or a game of Risk.
But I have
And it's
there's
sort of like,
there's a counterpoint to that.
okay.
John McCain.
Well,
Right?
no, okay.
Like,
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that the counterfactual is correct. Obviously, like a bad leader can come from anywhere. I think, including the battlefield. Clearly, obvious. What I'm saying is that I think that maybe the loss of like that sort of, I'm not going to say requirement, but kind of a prerequisite. You know what I mean? Like even Ike, it's sort of like when you look at Eisenhower's career, like it not just military service, not just battlefield experience, but also just like when he was part of the original expeditionary force, that Army expeditionary force, that of Army engineers that sort of like went from one side of the country to the other, kind of trying to map out the best routes for interstates and bridges and whatnot. Like it's sort of like again, you have like that broader perspective, and also just kind of skin in the game and knowledge of the terrain, not just the maps, not just the models, but the terrain itself. And that is what warfare is to some degree. It is the terrain, man. It is not a map. It is not a model. Those are things that are employed for life or death results, which is essentially all of reality. But it's very condensed um, and sort of hypercharged, like when you get into matters of war. And I think that for that reason, you are going to find your best leaders having at least some military experience.
With Eisenhower, I would say, I mean, he may not have been, on the front lines, like the landing at Omaha Beach or anything like that, but he absolutely positively had to win, the big battles, win the war, and so even there, I mean, there's a big difference where he had skin in the game versus, I mean, now you look at all the stuff that led up to the Afghanistan debacle where, they pull the troops out before they pull civilians out. They leave the more easily defended air bases, this landlocked country, and fall back on this harder to defend, count on the Taliban for the security at that air base to, like, we've just been fighting these guys for a while. Give the Taliban basically a kill list. Here's the people we would like to get out who have been working with us. Could you please, let them through? That kind of thing. Like all these series of blunders that like a E1 private in basic training wouldn't make. And they do it because it's absolutely zero skin in the game. They don't need to win the war. They just need to funnel a bunch of fucking money to their bankster, defense contractor buddies, and that's all it's about. And at the end of the day, they're going to cash in by getting a position on a board of Raytheon or whatever. Like General
just to interject with like Eisenhower, he did serve in the infantry in World War I. So he did have battlefield experience. He had skin in the game in a war, by the way, which was also kind of outrageous when you think about it.
You know who else? You know who else served in the infantry in World War I and was a decorated combat veteran?
Hitler.
Yeah. And he was an artist.
Yeah. Yes, like, he was.
Well, I hate to say it, but if we're talking like left-right brain balance, like, well.
Well, no, okay. So, but that's the thing, and that's why I said
we're not trying to be monetized here.
If you expand, but again, like the divine does not necessarily mean the divine good. Like I said, if you expand the frame of that picture on the Sistine Chapel.
Young was taught, and like Young was basically talking about like during the 30s, he was like, yeah, Hitler's pretty much possessed by the spirit of Odin. And do you guys ever see there's this famous 19th century painting of the Wild Hunt with like
Oh,
Odin in the front
yes.
of it? Have you seen this?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and it's like it's Hitler, like it's obviously Hitler, um, like that's just so creepy. Like, it's like before the guy was even born, and some artist like saw this vision, but yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. The divine does not
Yeah.
necessarily need to be that's not necessarily a good thing.
No, you could be in contact. And again, like it's sort of like when we look at art, and so it's sort of like, and you said, wow, it's creepy, it's spooky. It gets less creepy and spooky, I think, if you're willing to accept the premise that what art is, or what an artist is someone who can see someone outside of the normal chain of causality. That's a very difficult premise to accept. And again, particularly like in a society which I agree, generally speaking, is in the thrall of people who have that one big skateboard leg of a left hemisphere, which that hammer that they use to hammer down all problem nails. If you look at it in that reducible, mechanical, and I think really sort of childlike and immature way of looking at the human condition, as though everything is just sort of its surface and nothing else, then that's going to be very confusing to see paintings like that. It'd be very confusing even to imagine that, that in the Middle Ages you had people who were adorning their banners with dinosaurs, for example. And so, well, how could they know that? They didn't have no dinosaur bones. And it's just sort of like, so to cross that, and again, I think that is to some degree what the painting shows too, is that like, to penetrate the veil, even somewhat, is to in some ways see how all the various pieces connect into a coherent whole. Whereas the left would be more about, and again, both politically and maybe it aligns biologically, just like everything else does, that the left is more about tearing things apart, putting each piece under a microscope,
Well, and then
trying
the
to
left,
identify function through destruction, through you say deconstruction, but originally I think it was Heidegger
and
that's
that so the left hemisphere has this process of analysis and synthesis, right? Where it's like it's breaking things apart into their component elements, and then it tries to use a model of some sort to reassemble those parts into a coherent whole. But it forever fails to do this. Like it never quite is able to make that quantum jump from like the disconnected parts to the holistic entity. And the right hemisphere basically starts out seeing the whole, and then the parts are automatically seen in relation, in proportion to that whole. To bring this back to like the political question, actually, this connects too, right? One of the most annoying things about debating with people on like the hard left is that they have this, I find very often, this sort of like almost like autistic way of being like, well, here's this one exception, here's this one detail that you got wrong, therefore your whole argument is wrong. Right? They're really focused on these like small little niggling details. But when you pull back and you look at like their sort of uh overarching image of the whole of reality, you're like, man, that's completely bonkers insane. Conversely, I find very often with people who are more found on the right is that like they seem much more likely to get small details wrong. Like, think of like your MAGA memas getting into QAnon or something like that, right? Like they'll say a lot of stuff which is just like nonsense. Like it's just obviously not true. Or they'll get small details wrong. But yet the overarching narrative, like when they're talking about like, yeah, pedophile elites doing satanic rituals, it's like, is that literally true? Well, maybe not, but it's at least a metaphor level not far off from what's actually going on here, right? So yeah.
yeah. I mean, you're talking about
That's like,
essentially you're talking about the fallacy of composition, which
yeah,
like a lot of
okay,
people
yeah,
engage in left and right these days. But yeah, I think the sort of the postmodern left is a kind of fallacy generator almost. Like it is very difficult to have a fruitful conversation, and more so lately, I think, with someone who, particularly that fallacy, the composition fallacy, because it is essentially at the heart of it, at the heart of all fallacies. The exception is going to rule supreme over the rule. And that, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one point McGilchrist makes, and this is really fascinating, I think, is that, actually the schizophrenic doesn't suffer from a lack of logic, but from an overabundance of logic. So it's basically only logic, right? And so you can construct.
It's not the absence of reason. It's the absence of everything but reason.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, you can construct like the weirdest, craziest, like paranoid ideas that are totally logically sound and consistent, right? And so you can see that on the left as well these days, right? With some of these theories, and they're actually, it's, people often say like, oh, they're just illogical. I mean, there's certainly some of that too, but a lot of it is actually like super logical, right? So if you accept like the initial premise, that is, which of course, like you probably shouldn't, but that's a fascinating thing to watch, and you can see like how that makes people immune against arguments, because they, within their logic, it all makes perfect sense, and they can actually argue that stuff, and you see that the same thing with some of these wild, pseudoscientific or philosophical ideas, right? That we don't have consciousness or something like that, which is like totally logical. These people like are hyper intelligent and argue brilliantly, but the thing is, man, like maybe your initial premise, there's something wrong here. But
not only do they argue brilliantly, right? But especially with like academics, kind of academic scientists who will argue things like there's like consciousness is an illusion, it's generated by the brain, whatever. They frequently have phenomenal command of the details of how things work, right? Like they know their neurobiology. They can tell you like the different kinds of neurons and the different regions of the brain and like the specific functions that have been found to be performed by this or that like subcomponent of the brain. But they don't have that overarching holistic image.
Yeah, and this is a trap, this logic trap and detail trap. I think it can happen in all kinds of domains, right? And I think these days, we can see it in this political craziness, like more on the left, but it can happen also like on with right-wing philosophy and things like that. And conspiracy theory is actually also a good example. I mean, not that we all know there are conspiracies that are real, that's for sure, but there's this certain type of like crazy conspiracy thinking, where you go like, oh yeah, the cousin of the sister of this guy, worked for a university, and the dean was connected to the Rockefellers, and and there you go, it's controlled opposition, and that sort of thinking, which it can happen also on the right, for example, or it's just a trap, this hyper logic that is
conspiracy theorizing is when it becomes pathological. This is a left hemisphere trait, not a right hemisphere trait. Yeah. Sort of like have this like paranoid ideation that you sort of it's all plotting against me. This is the thing that schizophrenics do. Paranoid schizophrenia.
Well,
so
when I was reading Matter with Things, there was, when he was talking about certain types of schizophrenic like delusions, when I was reading through them, because there's a lot that are kind of like obscure that you don't really hear about. I was reading through them and I'm like, oh wow, a lot of this stuff is like just typical conspiracy theory like stuff. Like there's there are names for it, I forget them now, but so there was one about replacement people or something. So you like a spouse might think that his or her spouse has been replaced by a robot, like an imposter, and you see that in all kinds of conspiracy theories online where it's like, oh no, this person's been replaced. That's not the real Trump.
That's not real Joe Biden. That's a
But
clone.
maybe,
Or it's
hey,
not real
maybe.
Fetterman.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
just saying,
yeah.
well, again, there comes the premonition of art again, because what do we see? Every time that we see a concept that sounded like science fiction when we first heard it, that sounded like something unbelievable and fantastical. And lo and behold, suddenly we're smack dab in the middle of it. So, like, and I'm not saying that those people aren't crazy. I mean, I'm saying that you could be crazy and also, in some way, be. And as a matter of fact, I think it's very likely that in many cases, some people who have a variety of mental illnesses are rubbing up against that divine sphere, but they can't really tell reality. They can't tell apart. What was the metaphor someone came up with one time? It was of a coin that you find, and it's lying face up, and you're pointing at the coin, and some people will look at it and say, like, well, what does that coin show? Oh, it shows the face of a president. And then the crazy person will say, no, 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 it's an eagle. It's an eagle, right? And it's just like, they're right. There is an eagle under there. But it's both, really. And so I think that the idea of just, again, not having things in balance, that could be somebody who is way out of balance towards the right, and is just seeing the shapes outside of the cave instead of the shadows, but isn't seeing the shadows at all and doesn't see the cave. Something along those lines, where too much information, TMI, right? Too much happening too fast without the proper framework, without the balance and the care and the attention to detail, and so many of the things that go into, like, nurturing a mind to becoming a mature adult, kind of presence that can just assess, make logical assessments about reality, and conduct tests internally, and also imagine states, and do it with a kind of a grace and ease.
So this is like to build on that, like, I think, like, there are definitely times where you're sort of like, schizo, whether we're talking in the literal sense or just like the internet sense of schizo. They might not be literally factually correct in their description, but they may well be metaphorically correct, right? Like, an example I used in a recent piece was, like, with the midwit meme, talking about, like, vaccinations, where, like, the grug brain, who could stand in for the schizo, was like, I don't want no 5G magnets, in my skin or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's probably not literally true, but at a metaphor, but at like a metaphorical level, it's like, obviously there's something funny going on with this, which is not in your best interests. So, it's leading him to make the correct decision, right? So, I this is how I kind of think about Cliff High a lot of the time. Like, that, you'll say things, I'm like, I don't think that's at all true, like in a literal sense. But
it's picking up a pattern, right? Like
he's picking,
from the
exactly,
cosmos,
and he's a self-admitted paranoid schizophrenic. He is a self-admitted paranoid schizophrenic.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
your schizo left brain kind of interprets it like, like the signal that you're getting from the cosmos or whatever, like in kind of funny ways, right? So you go like, oh yeah, 5G magnets, whatever, but there's actually behind it is something real. And on that note, because I found it interesting, Mark, also what you said about, like, how to reach that sort of balance, and you also said, when critiqued rightfully, that we shouldn't talk about, like, the left brain doing this and the right brain, feeling that. And it's true, it's like, it's kind of like the selfish gene fallacy, right? So yeah, the selfish genes, they're plotting this and that, we shouldn't, like, it's not really how it works. I think a better way would be, like, to say, like, that there's an eye, like the real eye, or like the cosmic eye, or whatever it is, and this looks through the brain hemispheres. It's kind of like a like our the eye's way of interacting with reality, either through the left or the right brain hemisphere kind of thing, and that implies that you have a certain choice, right? So you can actually impact that process. The problem is that usually when we are in one mode or the other, especially if we're in left brain hemisphere mode, we identify with the left brain hemisphere. We think this is the I, right? So we cannot really, that's what McGilchrist says as well, in left brain hemisphere mode, that's all we know, so that's why it can be such a trap. And if you live exclusively in the left brain, then you think your I is the left brain, but in fact it's just a lens through which you look at the world. And I think that
I just want to add something to that. So as something of a panpsychist, I see it slightly differently. So when I'm hungry, I think that my stomach literally is hungry, that there's some aspect of my stomach that wants food, and that that translates through the brain, and that the part of the brain that it translates through, because it's getting signals from the stomach, wants me to eat. And I am somewhat separate, but encompass all of that. So I would say it may even be correct to say that the left brain wants something, and that the right brain sees something, but that is within a larger kind of field of awareness and cognition, because we have competing wants and desires, and some of them are very obviously, like, from an experiential basis, very obviously body based. Like, my body wants this, my body does not like this, but I can say, oh well, my body might not like this. My body, like in Dune, my body, my hand may not like this pain box and may want to pull out very much, but I am going to control it and override it and say no, because I actually want to keep my hand in this pain and in this box for a different reason, for a higher desire. So
well, that's an interesting
of-
way of looking at the word want, I guess. Like this might be semantics to some degree, I guess. I mean, it's sort of like that. For me, it's like reserving certain words for the person rather than the material. Like that's that. I'm just not sure like what the best language to use there is, because it feels like so much jargon has been generated by the fields of evolutionary biology, neurochemistry, et cetera, et cetera. It's just sort of like I guess I understand what Harrison's saying, and to some degree I agree with it, but like the use of that language, the idea that my stomach can want something. It's sort of like if I trace back the causal chain, it's like I want to stay alive and I need to eat to do it. And so whatever emanations, like if I have stomach pains, so it's like, yeah, there's a locality involved in there, because like this is something that maps directly back to the source of being. And like in order to persist in the material, I must feed. But it's like with the schizophrenia issue, like I think that to some degree it's born of like the idea of a multiplicity of being, like has been like sort of that's been the hip trend for the last couple of 100 years. This idea that like even being itself is somehow reducible to parts. This is what Mary Shelley was getting at in Frankenstein. In other words, like this was it's like people talk about the romanticists, but like really what Shelley was to some degree was something more like Uncle Ted Kaczynski of her time. She was seeing through the rise of surgical procedures, through various forms of pharmacology that were on the rise. Certainly, she was subjected to a very gruesome abortion slash miscarriage when she was young. She had seen the horrors of material reductionism and of like looking at the body as though it were a bunch of disparate parts, a machine, something that could be kind of cobbled together and torn apart at will.
And not only
And I
and
think
not
that
only and not only that, but like, I mean, at a deep metaphorical level, actually, the Frankenstein's monster works as a metaphor for how the left hemisphere tries to create reality.
yes,
So it's
yeah,
basically takes all of these disparate.
the monster is
It,
that version that yeah.
It is. So it's all of these disparate and individually lifeless parts, which are kind of stitched together and they're all out of proportion with one another. So like the final product is monstrous. And then, but still, even in that, a miracle has to be invoked, right? Like you actually don't have um a logical way for how those dead parts come together to make a
Yeah.
living whole. You have to
It's
have that little spark of magic that happens, because ultimately the left hemisphere
correct.
cannot animate. It cannot animate the dead, right?
And that is why,
Which
Victor calls the monster demon at many points throughout the novel. Remember,
mm,
that was really its alternative name, because even he recognized the idea that no, I am not God. I do not have the power to animate anything really. Certainly not in this um,
well,
unnatural way.
it was
And
the quintessential divine intervention, right? Like a lightning strike that gets channeled down, and you know, spark of light
well,
like coming down from
in
the
the book,
clouds.
it was different. To be fair, in the book, his
Oh,
midnight
is it? Okay.
labors were very, they were very. It was very like furtive. Like she described them as almost like a bunch of alchemy. This is a process that took like a long period of time. So there was alchemy. There was some kind of magic at play. There was, this was someone who had absorbed himself he's a university student, but he had traveled down a road of the occult of lost sciences and arts that he was sort of cobbling together. She makes it very mysterious in the book. I like the
Mhm.
movie interpretation is great with the bolt of lightning, and it's very Promethean and all that stuff.
Yeah, I just revealed
And it,
myself. I just revealed myself as someone who's never read the book and has only seen them.
it's a sloppy mess of a novel, but it's brilliant. It's brilliant in so many ways.
It's just
And prophetic to the point where you can almost, it's one of those novels where I would point to it and say you cannot deny that artists to some degree see the future. Now,
So
how
so
cloudy that
I
is,
want
or
to take
how
a step.
perfectly or imperfect that is.
as
I
you're
want to take a
talking
step back.
about that with the art, I mean, something that John said earlier when you were talking about people being metaphorically correct, and I think that kind of hits it at how, I guess, in looking at a piece of at a plot for a movie or a book and seeing what it kind of means versus the literal facts. It's like that left brain, right brain. Again, kind of reflects the ability to do that, to abstract meaning from it and recognize that the plot is fictional, that these events didn't actually happen, but that they represent something that is real about the world, versus somebody watching say they live and thinking it's like they literally are aliens and controlling us with
like,
radio
oh my
waves or
god,
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to lend support to what Harrison said, because I think that it's consistent with Mark's concerns, in that if you have that right balance, that what Harrison's saying is absolutely the case, right? So it's like, you perceive things as like, yeah, my stomach wants this, or my heart wants that. As long as you recognize that they're a part of a greater whole, that all makes sense and it's all consistent.
Yeah.
It's only if you're like pathologically splitting everything up and thinking of it as different that it becomes a problem. But I wanted to really, like, since we're kind of, we're coming up on 2 hours, I want to tie it back. Like, I've been wanting to say something about skin in the game, and kind of maybe transition into talking a little bit about why society writ large seems to be so left hemisphere dominant, and what segment of type of people that benefits, because I think that ties into Harrison's work too, chronology, with people that are left hemisphere dominant functionally don't have skin in the game in a very substantial way, because they're going to be able to participate in this highly technocratic, professionalized, credentialized system that's very bureaucratic, where there aren't consistent reality tests, and they're going to be able to do so with gusto, and they're going to be able to, chase those arbitrary metrics that the bureaucracy picks that you should be targeting. And they're not going to be so concerned about the fact that they're not actually doing anything productive, that functionally all they're doing is growing the size of the bureaucracy and siphoning more and more money away from the productive sector of the economy. They're going to be able to do it, and it's not going to be a problem. And in that process, when everybody gets all on board and left hemisphere, and you know what does that leave space for? It leaves sociopaths who also are, you know, they might not be left hemisphere dominant, but they really benefit from a situation where nobody's really able to see the big picture. You know, it's kind of like a fog of war situation where if everybody's so focused on these arbitrary things, it makes it easy for somebody that comes in that's not acting in good faith to manipulate those people and rise up and control perception. And I think that all those factors kind of work together in order to create just a very dangerous situation where everybody's very content to have this system where there's no reality checks. Everybody feels comfortable with the fact that nobody can be held accountable for anything going wrong because it's all distributed, which I think to some extent gets engineered by the sociopaths once they achieve enough influence. I kind of wanted to pivot there because that skin in the game thing really stuck out to me. And it does stick out to me as something that, like, we're never going to make it unless people have skin in the game. And a lot of times people think of that just in terms of straightforward incentives. And when you have that left hemisphere dominance, you can be like, oh, skin in the game. Well, we just got to have metrics and give them rewards for, you know, like performance. And it's like, no, because it's just going to get gamed if you don't have that proper balance where you can understand if, you know, in technocracy terms, we're talking about measures of performance and measures of efficacy. Like, do the measures of performance, like what you're actually doing, line up with the measures of efficacy? Like, is it making the difference that it's supposedly supposed to make?
Yeah, I think part of it, we talked about this before, right? Like the generals who like are on the front with their soldiers, right? And you could extend that analogy, I guess, to civilian life as well. You know, when you actually have to be in the midst of life, you know, where you're having an impact, right? So it's not an abstract number like on a spreadsheet that says, okay, we're doing this here at this corporation or in this bureaucracy office, and it's gonna impact, you know, like that many thousands people, and you come up with these metrics and these performance indicators and KPIs and, you know, blah blah blah. And but you actually live there, you know, like where the people are, you know, and you interact with them directly, you talk to them, and that's sort of like this being in life, you know, in the middle of life. And that's why when things were organized like on a much smaller scale, you know, maybe by a church, or then later by some local very local administration, you know, things worked kind of better, you know. And even with corporations, when you had small, I mean, the whole free market thing, you know, it comes from like this model of small craftsmen and things like that, where this stuff actually works. So I guess my point would be, I'm not sure if it can actually there's anything we can do, you know, in a large bureaucracy kind of setting, except, as you said, coming up with more like measures and like opening another department, the department for making sure the other department reaches their goals department, you know. And
Luke, I shit you not, I'm dealing like I don't know how much I can say without, I mean, so like that's exactly what has happened at work recently. Like they created this
The Department of
entire-
Departments.
No, it's called the well, I won't say what it's called, okay? But there's a department of several government scheduled civilians that it's like they got put at the division level, like across, like in the army, and it's like, oh, they're gonna evaluate all these programs, like are they working or not? It's like a whole extra department that got added. So like it's funny you say that. It's exactly
Well,
what's happening.
well, here's a question for anyone that's got like more like
key custodes, right? And like you just like it's custodes like all the way down, right? Like I mean, you just keep like adding additional layers of like It's like there's compliance officers. Well, then you need compliance officers for the compliance officers, and it just grows.
Yeah, I was going to say compliance, safety. Like when I was thinking about intelligence, because I was reading your other article, John, as well. Like that was talking about again, and also Eugipius came in later with a similar sort of perspective on the kind of the link between intelligence and putting untested medical products in your body. And so I was just sort of thinking, okay, so compliance, safety, and risk. And I was like, how do these things relate? Do they map cleanly onto hemispheric work of the brain, or is that something that's born elsewhere? Because I have a feeling it might be something that's born in neither hemisphere, but some
So
more
I have
central, something
I
more
have something on
central
that.
to.
Because
Yeah.
one of our leaders actually had a really good like little snippet. All right. And it's risk awareness, not risk aversion. And I think that's it in a nutshell. Like risk awareness is what you need. Risk aversion, especially in the military, is no bueno. Right. So you got to
Yeah,
have
which is part of total
like,
situational awareness, essentially,
but
right? You're just like,
yeah, but what hemisphere is gonna like if you're left hemisphere dominant, that's gonna get you into that risk aversion. It's like, oh my God, okay, so like I've identified a risk. Now what do I gotta do in order to mitigate that risk? It's like, well, maybe nothing. Maybe nothing can be done about it. Maybe exerting any resources to mitigate that risk isn't necessary. It's just something to be aware of. Like, hey, this course of action has this risk. This one has this risk. Just be aware of it, but don't be like, oh, we can't, wait, we gotta eliminate any
The
possible
problem
risk.
is that the left hemisphere will see like the identified risk as a problem to be solved by its very nature.
Yes.
And it also, while it's focused on solving that problem, it will be quite oblivious to any problems that might be caused by the solution that it is implementing. Which then, if you don't have the sort of wise intercession of the right hemisphere to say like in some cases like, hey, maybe do nothing, because all of the available options are worse
And
than
also
doing nothing,
the left
then
hemisphere.
things spiral, right? And it's like oh, like you have this one symptom, so you should take this medication that causes another symptom, so now you take another medication for that, and you sort of, next thing you know, you're on 10 pills a day.
And also the left hemisphere tends to over estimate risks, I think, because it kind of thinks the problem from the solution, right? So you can see, for example, in traffic policies and stuff, they will like assume that I don't know, like speed limit, harsher speed limit will save like that many dead people, and it's obviously just an assumption. They back it up with some statistics, but it's ultimately,
You just said that to brag about the Autobahn, didn't you?
Yeah, and no, but the thing, no, I mean, we're suffering from that too here. I mean, we're suffering that. I mean, they're becoming dictatorial here too, so I can't brag, unfortunately. But the thing is, and it's basically like you can have stats and stuff, but ultimately you cannot know this. You cannot know how many deaths, if any, like this will.
You can't take one metric and just extrapolate
but
in isolation from everything else.
Yeah, exactly. But and it's just BS science, basically. The whole traffic sign thing. I looked into it. I think it's just voodoo. It's left hemisphere voodoo because you can the left hemisphere always thinks in solutions. So you cannot like reduce death by, I don't know, just casting a spell, but you can reduce the speed limit. You can do that. So it's.
Well, I disagree about the spell casting, but no.
Yeah,
What I disagree about is actually like the idea that risk. So it's sort of like, here's where other things come into it, right? Because like everybody can identify a risk. Like Grant was saying, it's sort of like risk awareness, right? I'm aware of a ton of risks. Most of them are very, very practical. It's sort of like I'm not afraid that I'm going to get eaten by a tiger because I live in an apartment building, for instance. And it's sort of like, okay, so there are irrational fears of risks that don't exist, and then there are rational fears of risks that do exist. But all of that seems separate from the idea of, is the risk worth taking? So it's sort of like, and that I do not think is hemispheric work at all. I would not attribute that to a hemisphere. I would attribute that to the soul. in the sense that ultimately, and this is why I think things like principles map so directly to that ineffable quality of consciousness, the thing that wears the suit. And so it's sort of like ultimately any risk could be worth it, including risking your life. And here's where it gets real weird, including sacrificing your life. Now, this is where we get into like the real nitty gritty, right? And when we
Well,
talk about skin in the game,
to give
we're
like a
really talking about
concrete,
skin in the game here.
just quickly, Mark, just give a concrete example
Yeah.
of exactly what you're talking about, right? So, to go back to traffic. Okay, so you say you got a freeway and there's cars zooming around back and forth under almost any circumstances. Running into the middle of that freeway would be foolhardy. You would have to be an idiot to do that. But let's say that your toddler happens to have run there, and like the only way that you can is it now worth the risk to save your toddler's life to run into the middle of the freeway? And almost anyone would say, fuck yeah.
One of the things we were talking about, like something Grant said earlier, and I forget now precisely how he said it, but it reminded me of one of the best things about economics is the whole concept of opportunity costs that a lot of fields surprisingly don't even bring up or deal with, like the idea of opportunity costs. And that's like something that seems like it has to be a right hemisphere thing, because it's a kind of an order of abstraction above, like you're thinking not just about the thing that you're thinking about doing, but the counterfactual. If we don't do this, what's the cost going to be? If we do this, second order, third order effects, like what's the cost of that? And then comparing those costs, and just that opportunity cost seems like such a critical thing to keep in mind.
And trade-offs. I think it's like Thomas Sowell that famously said, like, all of life is trade-offs. Everything, there is no such thing as a net, as a net positive or negative loss gain scenario. Like in reality, in models there are, and you can always model something that is like a zero sum game. But like in reality, it's all trade-offs, right?
So much
so
of what
that's
he says
even
is
risks,
right. Yeah, because it's like, you have the leftists, like they want the perfect solution. That's the hallmark of it. It's like, if we just do this and ignoring all the costs of it, it's like, don't you want to save lives? Don't you want to, then this will save lives. So we just need to do this ad infinitum. The more we do it, the more lives we save, and that's got to be a good thing, right? And it's like, yeah, but
it's right down to the,
yeah.
There are definitely
it's right down to the blood and bone.
I don't want saved. There are definitely some lives I don't actually want saved that badly. But since we're wrapping up, I'm just going to say that the model of left hemisphere map, right hemisphere terrain kind of way of going back and forth between those two is, in my mind, it's very useful, explains a lot, but it's also a model. And just to touch on something Marcus is saying there, I mean, like, it's not a model that actually does explain everything, and that is worth keeping in mind about this model as well as any other.
Right on.
Cool.
It works in practice. The key question is, does it work in theory? That's
terrain, not map.
Yeah.
Yeah, this will be probably a recurring theme that we come back to from time to time, just as we discuss anything, because it's useful. Just like how this is not the first article that John wrote on this exact topic. It's the second article that he wrote on it or expanded on it. I think it's just something that's always kind of worth considering. But that said, thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of Tonic Discussions. If you made it all the way to the end, what are you doing if you haven't liked and subscribed and commented? It's time to leave a comment. If you made it all the way to the end of just a bunch of dudes talking for 2 hours, engage. We want to hear from you. What'd you think?
Better yet, track down one of our Substacks and engage there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And get the podcast from your subscribe to the podcast from your podcast app. That's what I would do.
Yeah, in case we get canceled from YouTube.
Yeah. And then you don't have to have the video. You can, listen while you're mowing your lawn. Anyway, we will see you all next time.